the voice of Alabama politics, with your host, Bill Brett. Now, the #1 political show in Alabama, The V.
We're at day 3 at the Mike Hubbard criminal trial here in Lee County. I'm Bill Britt.
And I'm Susan Britt.
Coming to you for Alabama political reporter and the voice of Alabama politics. Susan, today was especially interesting. It seemed like everything, once again, was going in the prosecution's favor, when all of a sudden they had a witness that seemed to change the testimony that they had relied on. That was Don Williamson, the former health officer of the state of Alabama, a man who many have high regards for, seemed to change his testimony in midstream, and as a matter of fact, the next witness contradicted him.
Yes, there wasn't a Dr. Williamson, and I talked to a couple of colleagues today that we've seen previously in press, in the press rooms, talking to us in the hall, explaining things. He seemed like a man under a lot of pressure, someone who had been talked to, or something wasn't exactly right.
Something was a little off kilter. When Matt Hart was quizzing him, prosecutor Matt Hart was quizzing Dr. Williamson about a meeting he had with Mike Hubbard, in which he and Blaine Gallagher, at that time the liaison from the governor's office, went over and approached the speaker, Mr. Hubbard, about taking the 23 words that had been placed in the Medicaid budget that gave APCI a monopoly. He recalled that the speaker told him that he would help take the language out, that he was angry because Farrell Patrick had not told him that it was specific for APCI, and then the bombshell. Williams said at that meeting, Speaker Hubbard told him that he also had a contract with APCI. That was later on contradicted by Stephanie Azar.
Yes, was also contradicted by Stephanie Azar that Dr. Williamson put it on Greg Wren that it was his language that was in this bill, and that Speaker Hubbard was going to have it taken out. Well, according to Stephanie Azar, this was not the same meeting. Apparently she was in, because the speaker didn't mention anything about taking the language out, simply told them to go work it out with Representative Wren.
And that's what she did, and she said that they met with Representative Wren, and he was very angry. He was very upset and refused to take the language out, said it was good for the state. Now, both Williamson and Azar agreed that they were shocked that this language had been put in the legislative budget without their knowledge, without their approval, without any input from them.
It had, and it was even it even went so far as to be voted on the House floor. It ultimately ended up in subcommittee, but it was voted on in the bill.
Now, we have heard from Josh Blades, we have heard from a few other folks, and then we heard that Speaker Hubbard was wanting to take the language out of the legislation even before he voted on it. But Stephanie Azar, once again, didn't see it that way.
She didn't see it that way. She's been the one contradiction in this whole thing. It's as though everything has kind of been, everybody got their story straight before they got over here to Lee County.
You know, we confronted Ms. Azar and Don Williamson in the elevator as they were leaving the office, and I brought up, or leaving the court, and I brought up the fact, I said, were you both in the same meeting? And they said, yes. And I said, you certainly have different recollections. Their attorney said, oh, it's basically the same. It was totally contradictory.
It was totally contradictory. And
they
said, and in the light of that, they also said when they first came out, I'm sorry, but we didn't hear each other testify.
Yeah, like so. You don't want to hear. That's the whole reason we don't let people hear each other testify. I imagine Dr. Williamson's testimony is going to be further contradicted. Matt Hart, this is the first time we've seen him angry in court. He basically asked Williams why he had changed his testimony, and Williams said, well, if you'll go back and look at our prior meeting, I did mention all these things. He mentioned Matt Hart did not have a memory of him mentioning it.
No,
he had notes.
He didn't, yeah, and he also has probably the recorded testimony, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, it was very shocking. You know, I've had a lot of respect for Dr. Williams over the years, but this he kept sinking down in his chair,
He did.
putting his head down.
He kept putting his head down when he would answer, especially when he was answering about he and Greg Rand's prior friendship before all of this happened, and how this had really, really torn at their friendship.
Now, one of the things that happened earlier is Steve Klaus, who was serving as vice chair of the General Fund Budget Commission, he was the one who was instrumental in that committee having the language put in that gave a monopoly to Hubbard's business client, gave the monopoly. He had a few things to say about that meeting as well.
He did. And first of all, you know, that somebody can't just put language in a bill. It has to go through the chairman of the committee. And Klaus, in a meeting with Hubbard and Blades and Patrick, said that the idea here, Farrell Patrick had come with this great idea that would save Medicaid $10 million so they could move this over to the courts.
Yeah, and then later on, Norris Green, who was the head of the financial side of the legislative fiscal office, he was the head of that. He said that he was in a meeting with Hubbard and Wren and Patrick.
Apparently the same meeting.
Yeah, where they said that they wanted to take the money from Medicaid and give it to Roy Moore specifically. And Speaker Hubbard said he was in favor of taking the $10 million from Medicaid to give it to Moore because he wanted a favor from Roy Moore.
Now, here's the thing you need to pay attention to. If they move $10 million from Medicaid to the courts, that means $2 for every $1 will come out of Medicaid because we'll lose the federal match, which means they would take $30 million out of Medicaid to get a favor from Roy Moore.
Yeah, I mean, that was some stinky testimony.
It was some very, very stinky testimony.
You know, it was also interesting after Mr. Norris testified about about that portion of the meeting. He also, you know, testified that it had to go to the speaker. It didn't come from the speaker necessarily. That it actually, even though the speaker had brought it up to him, that Klaus was the chairman and that the law had to go through the chairman.
It did, and in a meeting also, two of Norris Green's assistants in the LFO with all of this language said that in the meeting that they were in, when Farrell Patrick was discussing this to the LFO and telling them and told them that, you know, Wren told them they needed to go and talk to Klaus the next day. The last thing that apparently Farrell Patrick said to both of these ladies, both of them, Rachel Riddle and Mary Lawrence, the last thing he said was, "This comes from the speaker."
We were sent from the speakers what he said because Ms. Riddle and the other lady who spoke with him said that they would be passing this along to Chairman Klaus, and he intimated not that wasn't necessary. He said, we were sent here by the speaker.
Right.
So, you know, we know it, and because we've covered this for 3+ years, nothing gets done in the House without the approval of the speaker. The APCI was paying Hubbard big bucks, $10,000 a month, and he wanted to get them legislation that would grant them a monopoly and give them a $20 million a year profit.
Now, there was another revelation that Representative Klaus gave us today, when he was in the meeting where Speaker Hubbard was presenting before both Governor Bentley and Greg Canfield, the Director of Commerce, that he was in the meeting where the Speaker was basically lobbying them for commercial jet to come to Dothan, because at that time Speaker Hubbard's claim was Southeastern Gas District, and they would gain a lot of business by the employees that would be increased by moving that business to Dothan.
Now, one of the things that Bill Baxley, the defense attorney, said, well, he said, you know, the commercial jet, they don't use gas like it was some big revelation. And then Klaus said, well, the some 200 families that moved in to our district, they all use gas. So
yeah, because as a result of the jobs increasing in that area,
It was, you know, basically an interesting day, not because of what necessarily was a win or a lose for the defense or the prosecution. The most interesting part of the day is to find out why Don Williamson had a different testimony than the prosecution thought he was going to have. I'm Bill Britt.
And I'm